Ever feel like disagreements just have a way of turning into, like, relationship hurricanes? You know,
Yeah.
those blow-ups that leave you wondering, wait, how did we even get here? Well, today's deep dive is all about turning that storm into something that actually strengthens your bond. We're diving into a chapter called Navigating Conflict with Love. And trust me, it's about to get interesting.
It really makes you rethink how we usually approach conflict, doesn't it? Like, instead of it being this thing to be avoided at all costs,
Uh-huh.
which, let's be honest, is pretty impossible. It's about shifting our whole perspective.
Yeah, because isn't it kind of reassuring to know that even the strongest relationships out there, they still have those bumps in the road? It's not about if we disagree, but how we handle it, right?
Absolutely. And the source actually kicks things off with this really vivid scene, almost like something out of a movie. It's a couple, and they're in the middle of this huge argument.
Yeah.
And outside, there's this massive storm raging.
Okay, gotta admit, I'm intrigued now. A storm.
That's a powerful image, though. How does that tie into conflict, though? Well, think about how a storm feels. You know, that chaotic energy, the tension, maybe even a little bit of fear about what's to come. That's exactly how conflict can feel on the inside, like our own personal emotional weather event.
So we're not just talking about a little drizzle here. We're talking full-blown Category 5 hurricane of emotions.
Exactly. And this couple in the chapter, they're right there in the thick of it, with the storm outside mirroring the storm that's happening inside their relationship. They're saying things they probably don't even mean, feeling completely misunderstood.
Ooh, I know that feeling. Those moments where you just kind of want to scream into the void. But I'm guessing the chapter doesn't just leave them stranded in the middle of the hurricane, though, does it?
You know me better than that.
Yeah.
Here's where it gets really good, just like a real storm. Eventually, the chaos subsides, the clouds part, the sun peeks through, and the couple, they come out the other side, but with a deeper understanding of each other.
It's like that.
Mhm.
Calm after the storm,
Right.
where the air feels cleaner,
Yeah.
and you can just kind of
Mhm.
see things more clearly.
Exactly. And that's what's so brilliant about how this source connects that whole storm analogy to conflict. It's not that the conflict magically disappears, but they've used that energy, that intensity, to kind of clear the air, to address things that maybe they'd been avoiding.
Yeah. It's like conflict becomes this opportunity to kind of rebuild even stronger than before.
Precisely. And this leads to a point the source makes that I think is so important for everyone to hear. Conflict itself isn't the enemy. It's how we approach it that matters. In fact, the chapter argues that conflict is inevitable in any close relationship.
Which, honestly, is kind of a relief because who hasn't been in a disagreement with their partner
Mm.
and thought, oh no, does this mean we're doomed? Knowing that it's normal, I think really takes the pressure off of needing to be perfect.
I love that. It's so true. And the source uses this really interesting analogy to illustrate this whole idea of navigating conflict. They compare it to learning to dance with a partner.
Okay, now that's an analogy I can get behind.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
So think about, like those first few dance lessons, you're bound to step on each other's toes. Maybe even trip over your own 2 feet a few times, right?
Been there, done that. Have the bruised toes to prove it.
Right. But here's the thing. As you practice,
Hmm.
as you learn to anticipate your partner's movements, as you start to really hear the music together, that's when the magic happens.
Yeah, instead of this series of missteps, it becomes this graceful flow. I see where you're going with this.
It's the same with conflict. Initially, it might feel messy, uncomfortable, like you're both kind of fumbling around in the dark. But the more we learn to hear each other's music, so to speak, those underlying needs, fears, desires, that are really driving the conflict, the closer we get to moving together in a way that feels less like a battle and more like a shared exploration.
Okay, I love that. Moving from battle to shared exploration. But how do we actually do that? Because let's be real, sometimes in the heat of the moment, the other person's perspective just seems completely irrational.
That's where the source gets really practical, which I appreciate. It dives into the why behind the anger. And this part is so insightful. It suggests that most arguments, at their core, stem from unmet needs. The need to be heard, to feel respected, valued, understood.
So it's not just about who's right or wrong on the
Mhm.
surface,
Mhm.
but about recognizing those deeper needs that are kind of driving the whole interaction. That's huge.
It totally reframes the situation. And once we understand those underlying needs, both our own and our partners, it becomes much easier to approach the conflict with empathy and compassion, which leads us to what the source calls techniques for compassionate communication.
Okay, so this is where the rubber meets the road. What do these magic techniques give us the goods?
Well, the source emphasizes that these aren't just quick fixes, they're skills. And
Yeah.
just like any skill, the more you practice, the better you become. They cover a range of techniques, but let's start with one that I think we could all probably use a little more of, pausing before reacting.
Oh, the pause. Easier said than done right, especially for those of us whose mouths sometimes operate on like a 5-second delay.
I hear you. But the source really emphasizes how powerful that pause can be when things start to escalate, when you feel those emotions rising. Just taking a few deep breaths before responding can make all the difference.
Yeah. It's about getting a little space
Yeah,
between the feeling and the reaction,
right.
stepping off autopilot for a second.
Yes. It allows you to choose a more thoughtful response instead of just reacting from a place of pure emotion. And another technique they highlight is the importance of I statements.
Ah, yes. The classic I statement, I'll admit. I used to think those were a bit of a therapy cliche,
Mhm.
but I've come to realize how powerful they can be when used genuinely.
It's about owning your experience without placing blame, which can be so disarming in a conflict. So instead of saying, you're always late, you could try, I feel stressed and disrespected. When our plans change last minute,
Yeah. Subtle shift. But it totally changes the tone, doesn't it? It invites understanding instead of defensiveness. So what else is in this compassionate communication toolkit?
active listening is another big one. And the source really dives into what that looks like in practice.
Because I think a lot of people think they're actively listening, but really they're just waiting for their turn to talk.
Right, you're spot on. It's about genuinely trying to understand the other person's perspective, even if you don't agree with it. It's about paying attention to their tone, their body language, even what they're not saying.
Yeah, it's about making them feel truly heard and seen, which I think can be so powerful in those heated moments.
Exactly. And sometimes active listening means putting aside your own agenda, your need to be right, and just creating that space for the other person to fully express themselves, which, as you can imagine, isn't always easy.
Especially when you feel like your back is against the wall, or like you're convinced you have the most logical argument in the history of arguments.
The struggle is real. And that's why the source also talks about the importance of taking breaks when things get too heated.
Yes. Sometimes you just need a time out
Right.
to cool down, gather your thoughts.
Absolutely. It's not about avoiding the conversation altogether, but about recognizing when you need to step back to engage more effectively. It also signals to the other person that you respect them enough to not say something that you'll regret later.
Taking a break for respect. I love that reframing. So we've got pausing, I, statements, active listening, and taking breaks. What else is in this compassionate communication toolkit? It's like hitting the pause button on the dance floor for a minute. Catch your breath, make sure you're still in sync before you get back out there. But we can't just stand on the sidelines forever, though.
Right.
What happens when we are ready to kind of jump back into the conversation?
That's where the source's final technique comes in, shifting the focus from dwelling on the problem to actively looking for solutions together. It's about moving from blame to brainstorming.
Okay, so less. You always do this.
Yeah.
And more like, okay, how do we make this work for both of us?
Exactly. It's about asking questions like, what do we both need to feel good about moving forward? It becomes less about winning the argument and more about finding a path forward. That feels good for everyone involved.
It's like you're no longer on opposing teams, but you're suddenly teammates, working towards a shared goal. That's a game changer.
And here's the best part. The source doesn't just throw these techniques at you and wish you luck. It actually encourages you to practice them, to try them out in a safe space before you're in the heat of a real disagreement.
Hey, tell me more about this. How do they suggest we practice these?
Yeah.
Like compassionate communication superpowers.
They suggest role playing. Now, before you say anything, I know it sounds a little out there, but hear me out. They suggest finding a friend, or even your partner if you're feeling brave, and picking a recent conflict, or even a hypothetical one, and taking turns practicing these techniques.
So it's like a dress rehearsal for those real-life conflicts. You get to test out the techniques, work out the kinks
Yeah.
in a low-stakes environment. I love that.
Me too. And you know what I appreciate most about this whole chapter is how it reframes conflict as an opportunity for growth, for deeper intimacy. It's not this thing to be feared or avoided, but rather a chance to strengthen the very fabric of our relationships.
It's like instead of conflict being a wrecking ball, it becomes the material we use to build a stronger foundation. That's the power of approaching it with love, isn't it? So much more than just avoiding arguments. It's about using them to build something even stronger.
Absolutely. It's about approaching even the tough conversations with a spirit of curiosity, empathy, and a genuine desire to understand.
Which, let's be real, isn't always easy. But like you said earlier, it's a practice. And the more we practice bringing those compassionate communication skills to the table, the more we can transform those conflict storms into opportunities for deeper connection and growth.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So as you go about your day-to-day, think about those relationships where maybe conflict is showing up. How can you use these tools, the pause, the I statements, that shift to solution-focused thinking, to transform those disagreements into opportunities for deeper understanding? You might be surprised at how much stronger your relationships can become when you embrace conflict as a chance to build each other up rather than tear each other down. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.